deep in the bureaucratic nightmare that was the Galactic Health and Safety Monitoring Division's 47th Sub-Department for Questionable Biological Activities. Professor Quilnox Zanderpiller stared at his data terminal with the kind of expression typically reserved for discovering that your pet had not only evolved opposable thumbs, but had also filed a formal complaint with intergalactic animal rights organizations. The numbers glowing on his screen didn't just look wrong. They looked catastrophically, monumentally, universe-bendingly wrong, as if someone had fed a supercomputer nothing but existential philosophy, expired milk, and deeply disturbing fan fiction. "Blitherick Flumpadoodle," he bellowed to his assistant, whose 17 tentacles were currently wrapped around what appeared to be 43 different scientific instruments, while simultaneously filing reports, making tea, and apparently practicing interpretive dance. "Tell me these readings are some kind of elaborate practical joke. Tell me you've been conducting unauthorized experiments with the quantum flux capacitors again." Blitherick's 7 eye stalks drooped in perfect synchronization, creating the universal gesture of someone who was about to deliver news so catastrophically bad that it might actually violate several laws of physics. "I've quadruple-checked the atmospheric scanners, sir. Then I quintuple-checked them. Then I had a nervous breakdown and checked them 17 more times while crying into a bucket of fermented algae. The third planet from that unremarkable yellow star in sector Milky Way Theta 7. The inhabitants are consuming lethal quantities of a highly toxic alkaloid compound, daily, sometimes multiple times daily. Some of them consume it hourly." Professor Quilnox felt his 3 hearts skip approximately 14 beats, while his gill slits performed what could only be described as a panicked flutter dance. In his 642 years as head of the Galactic Health Monitoring Division's Department of Species, who really should know better, he'd encountered some truly disturbing phenomena. There were the rock-eating crystallines of Gamma Centauri, who had somehow evolved to find granite delicious. The methane-breathing gaseous beings of Nebula 7, whose idea of a relaxing evening involved inhaling what most species considered industrial waste. And that one particularly troubling civilization on the outer rim that had somehow made elevator music not just their national anthem, but their primary form of currency, communication, and reproductive ritual. But this was something entirely different. This was something that made all those other impossible biological adaptations look like perfectly reasonable lifestyle choices made by sensible, well-adjusted beings with excellent decision-making capabilities. The data streaming across his multiple monitors was crystal clear, horrifyingly precise, and utterly impossible. The bipedal mammals of the third planet were systematically, deliberately, enthusiastically poisoning themselves with a substance called caffeine, a compound so spectacularly dangerous that even the notorious toxic Corian deathworms, whose hobbies included eating radioactive waste and playing professional sports with live explosives, used it as their preferred method of pest control. "But, sir," Blitherick ventured, his voice carrying the tremulous quality of someone about to suggest something so utterly, completely, fundamentally insane that it might cause reality itself to file a formal protest. "They're not dying. In fact, according to our bioscanners, they appear to, oh, cosmic void, help us all. They seem to enjoy it." Professor Quilnox's secondary brain, the one responsible for processing information that was too stupid for his primary brain to handle, nearly experienced what could only be described as a complete existential meltdown. The readings showed humans not only surviving their daily poison intake, but actually exhibiting dramatically increased productivity, enhanced cognitive function, and what appeared to be supernatural levels of enthusiasm for activities that should have been mind-numbingly boring. It was like watching someone drink liquid fire, follow it with a battery acid chaser, and then decide that this was the perfect time to reorganize their sock drawer, compose a symphony, and solve several complex mathematical theorems while humming cheerfully. "Impossible," Quilnox declared, slamming his primary appendage on the control panel with such force that 3 nearby star charts spontaneously combusted. 2 coffee machines in the break room exploded in sympathetic resonance, and a small moon in a distant solar system shifted slightly in its orbit. No sentient being with even the slightest regard for basic survival instincts would willingly consume neurotoxins for pleasure. There must be some form of advanced mind control involved, perhaps parasites, alien influence, an incredibly sophisticated and malevolent marketing campaign, demonic possession, bad parenting. The intercepted Earth transmissions only made the situation exponentially more horrifying. Humans had not only dedicated establishments called coffee shops, which were apparently temples devoted to the worship and consumption of liquid poison, but they had created elaborate rituals, complex social hierarchies, entire economic systems, and what appeared to be religious movements centered around the preparation, consumption, and discussion of their toxic brew. They had developed specialized vocabulary, professional training programs, competitive events, and artistic movements, all focused on their daily poisoning routine. Some humans claimed they literally could not function without their morning dose of toxins, which, from a xenobiological perspective, was about as terrifying as discovering that a species had evolved to require regular doses of molten lava to maintain basic cognitive function. "Sir," Blitherick whispered, his voice barely audible above the humming of the ship's engines and the distant sound of Professor Quilnox's worldview crumbling into tiny pieces. "What if they're already too far gone? What if this coffee has already transformed them into something completely beyond our understanding? What if they're not even really the same species anymore?" Quilnox stared at the data stream showing humans queuing at something called Starbucks, with the kind of devoted dedication typically reserved for religious pilgrimages, royal coronations, or really, really good sales on consumer electronics. The implications were staggering, mind-bending, and frankly quite rude to several fundamental laws of biology. An entire species, millions, possibly billions of individual organisms, systematically poisoning themselves on a daily basis, and not only surviving, but apparently thriving, building complex civilizations, developing advanced technology, creating art, literature, music, and what their databases indicated was something called interpretive dance, all while consuming quantities of neurotoxins that should have rendered them extinct approximately 5 minutes after their first sip. It violated every principle of evolutionary biology, common sense, basic survival instincts, and what Professor Quilnox had always considered to be the fundamental cosmic rule that intelligent life forms should at least try not to poison themselves into oblivion before lunch. "We need a closer look," Quilnox decided, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone making a decision that would definitely end up in the "What were you thinking?" section of his eventual autobiography, assuming he survived long enough to write one. "Deploy the discretion-class reconnaissance probe. We're going in for a closer examination of this impossible phenomenon." The probe launch went about as well as most galactic reconnaissance missions undertaken by beings whose understanding of the target species could be generously described as thoroughly inadequate, which is to say, it went spectacularly, hilariously, catastrophically wrong. The discretion-class vessel, despite its name suggesting subtlety and careful observation, had all the stealth capabilities of a supernova, experiencing a midlife crisis and anger management issues. It crashed directly into what Earth databases cheerfully labeled as a Dunkin' Donuts in downtown Seattle, creating a crater approximately the size of a regulation space volleyball court, which the local humans promptly, inexplicably, and with characteristic human optimism, turned into an art installation called Cosmic Blend, a meditation on interstellar beverage delivery. Lee, from the smoking wreckage of their supposedly sophisticated surveillance equipment, the probe's emergency backup sensors transmitted back what would later be classified as the most disturbing, bewildering, and profoundly unsettling footage ever recorded in the entire history of galactic civilization. Humans were gathering around steaming cups of the toxic substance like moths drawn to a particularly attractive flame, inhaling its vapors with expressions of pure, unadulterated bliss, making sounds that could only be described as happy noises. And then, this was the part that made Professor Quilnox seriously question whether reality itself had developed some kind of substance abuse problem. They were actually paying money for the privilege of consuming what their chemical analysis confirmed was essentially legalized poison, served in convenient portable containers with little cardboard sleeves to prevent burns. By the 7 moons of Zorblat and the 14 sacred tentacles of the cosmic squid, Blitherick gasped, watching a human female actually smile, not grimace, not wince, not exhibit any of the facial expressions typically associated with consuming deadly toxins, while consuming what their advanced chemical analysis equipment confirmed was essentially a concentrated neurotoxin solution mixed with heated plant juice and what appeared to be some kind of milk-based foam that had been arranged into decorative patterns. She's enjoying it, look at her face. That's not the expression of someone under duress, suffering from mind control, or experiencing the early stages of poisoning. That's contentment, that's satisfaction, that's someone having what humans apparently consider a good time. The probe's bioscanners, designed to detect even the slightest signs of biological distress, went completely haywire, trying to process what they were observing. According to every known principle of xenobiology, humans consuming caffeine should have been exhibiting symptoms of acute poisoning: decreased cognitive function, impaired motor control, system-wide toxicity, and probably spontaneous combustion. Instead, they were demonstrating enhanced cognitive function, improved mood, increased alertness, supernatural levels of morning productivity, and what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm for facing what their cultural databases suggested were typically considered unpleasant daily activities like work, traffic, and other humans before 9 a.m. It was like watching evolution run backward while doing a complicated dance routine and somehow managing to land gracefully on its feet while juggling flaming objects and solving complex mathematical equations. "We need a field agent," Quilnox announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a decision that would definitely be studied by future xenobiologists as an example of either groundbreaking scientific courage or spectacular professional stupidity. Someone brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to infiltrate their society and observe this coffee consumption ritual firsthand. Someone willing to risk life, limb, and sanity to understand how an entire species has managed to turn daily poisoning into what appears to be a cornerstone of their civilization. Endure that someone turned out to be junior research assistant Florbish Quendaplex, whose primary qualifications included an unfortunate combination of crushing boredom with his current assignment cataloging the mating habits of sentient space moss, a complete inability to recognize danger even when it was performing tap dance routines on his head while wearing a neon sign that said, "This is extremely dangerous," and what his supervisors politely described as an adventurous spirit, but which was more accurately characterized as a shocking lack of basic survival instincts combined with curiosity levels that bordered on pathological. Florbish's human disguise was adequate, if you squinted, in very dim lighting, while suffering from severe head trauma and possibly some form of vision impairment. He'd spent exactly 37 minutes studying human anatomy through intercepted television broadcasts, which was 36 minutes longer than he'd spent studying common sense, basic safety protocols, or the concept of thinking things through before doing them. He arrived on Earth looking like someone who had heard humans described by someone else who had only seen humans in poorly lit photographs taken from very far away during an earthquake while wearing sunglasses. "Remember," Professor Quilnox's voice crackled through the quantum communicator, cleverly disguised as what Florbish desperately hoped looked like a normal human ear accessory. "Observe but do not, under any circumstances, consume the poison. We have absolutely no idea what caffeine might do to Andromedan physiology, and I refuse to explain to your next of kin why you died from voluntary toxin consumption while pretending to be human." Florbish nodded, his head moving in a way that definitely looked completely natural if you'd never actually seen a human head move before, and were perhaps a bit confused about how necks worked. He approached his first target, a cheerfully decorated establishment called Joe's Coffee Corner, which, according to their hastily assembled linguistic analysis software, was either a beverage establishment, some kind of tribal gathering place, or possibly a torture chamber that had been decorated by someone with an unusually optimistic outlook on life. Given what they knew about coffee, all three possibilities seemed equally plausible. The interior was a maze of caffeinated chaos that defied several laws of physics and at least two fundamental principles of rational behavior. Humans stood in perfectly orderly lines, waiting their turn to consume poison, with the kind of patience typically reserved for religious ceremonies, government bureaucracy, or really good sales on electronics. They chatted pleasantly with each other, read books, tapped on small electronic devices, and exhibited every sign of being perfectly normal, well-adjusted individuals who definitely weren't about to voluntarily consume neurotoxins. They had developed an entire specialized vocabulary around their toxic ritual: espresso, latte, cappuccino, macchiato, americano. Words that sounded like incantations in some ancient coffee cult, or possibly the names of demons who specialized in beverage-related temptation. "Welcome to Joe's," chirped a human female, whose name tag identified her as Destiny Rodriguez Patterson, which seemed like either terrible irony, excellent foreshadowing, or possibly just unfortunate nominal determinism taken to its logical extreme. Her smile was so bright it could have powered a small spacecraft, and she radiated the kind of enthusiasm typically associated with people who had either found their true calling in life or had consumed dangerous quantities of mind-altering substances. "What can I get you today? First time here? You look a little uncertain." Florbish's vocal translator, a device that had been designed for standard diplomatic encounters and was definitely not equipped to handle whatever was happening in this situation, worked overtime to process this simple greeting, eventually settling on something that sounded vaguely human-ish if you weren't paying too much attention and maybe had some background noise to mask the more obviously alien aspects. "I would like to observe the poison consumption ritual for cultural research purposes." Destiny's smile faltered for approximately 0.3 seconds, just long enough for her brain to process what he'd said, before professional customer service training, caffeine-enhanced reflexes, and what appeared to be genuinely cheerful disposition kicked in simultaneously. "Oh, you must be foreign, from somewhere with really different coffee culture. First time trying real coffee? That's so exciting. I definitely recommend starting with something mild, maybe a vanilla latte with extra foam and a shot of caramel. Or if you're feeling adventurous, our house blend is really smooth. Vanilla latte with extra foam and a shot of caramel." The word sent chills down Florbish's spine-equivalent appendage. They weren't content with consuming just one poison. They were mixing multiple poisons, adding flavoring agents, sweetening compounds, and what appeared to be additional chemical modifications to make their neurotoxin consumption more palatable, more appealing, more addictive. This was exponentially more sophisticated than anything in their worst-case scenario projections. This suggested levels of systematic poison optimization that challenged everything they thought they understood about self-preservation instincts. Yes, foreign, Florbish managed, watching in fascinated horror as Destiny began operating a machine that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought espresso makers should also double as medieval torture devices, spacecraft engines, and possibly musical instruments. Steam hissed with the fury of angry dragons. Metal clanged like the forges of some caffeinated underworld, and various substances that definitely weren't meant to be consumed by any living being swirled together in what could only be described as a chemistry experiment that had decided to embrace chaos as a lifestyle choice. The process was mesmerizing in the way that natural disasters, train wrecks, and really spectacular explosions tend to be mesmerizing. Destiny moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times, grinding beans with mechanical precision, operating steam wands with artistic flair, and creating what appeared to be liquid poison with the kind of care and attention typically reserved for preparing medicine, creating art, or diffusing bombs. The finished product was placed before him with a flourish. A cup containing dark liquid topped with foam that had been artistically arranged into what Destiny proudly announced was a Rosetta pattern. Apparently, humans had elevated poison preparation to such a level that they created decorative art in the foam, while simultaneously preparing to consume neurotoxins. Florbish stared at it with the kind of fascination typically reserved for natural disasters, historical artifacts, or particularly gruesome traffic accidents. "That'll be $4.50, Destiny announced cheerfully, as if requesting payment for poison was the most normal, reasonable, perfectly acceptable transaction in the universe. Florbish handed over the local currency he'd acquired through methods that were definitely legal if you didn't ask too many questions and possibly involved some creative interpretation of intergalactic trade regulations, and found himself holding a cup containing what his hidden scanner quietly confirmed contained enough caffeine to power a small spacecraft's navigation system for approximately 6 parsecs. The smart thing, the intelligent thing, would have been to dispose of it safely, report back to headquarters with his observations, and recommend immediate quarantine of the entire planet until they could figure out how to stage an intervention for a species that had obviously developed some kind of collective substance abuse problem. Unfortunately, Florbish had never been particularly smart, and his curiosity levels had always been inversely proportional to his common sense. The first sip was revelatory, not in the "oh, this is a pleasant beverage" way, but in the "oh dear gods of the cosmic void, what have I done, and why is everything suddenly so much more interesting than it was 5 seconds ago" way. The caffeine hit his Andromedan nervous system like a freight train, colliding with a library during a philosophy conference, sudden, violent, chaotic, and resulting in a lot of scattered information flying around at dangerous speeds while everything suddenly made perfect sense in ways that probably violated several natural laws. His 7 eye stalks began vibrating at frequencies that shouldn't have been physically possible according to any known principles of Andromedan biology. His 3 hearts started beating in syncopated rhythms that sounded like an alien jazz ensemble performing experimental music during an earthquake. Most disturbingly, his brain began working at approximately 27 times its normal capacity, which, given his usual mental output, was like watching a pocket calculator suddenly achieve consciousness, develop strong opinions about quantum physics, and decide to solve every mathematical problem in the universe while composing poetry and discovering the meaning of life. "Oh, my cosmic ancestors and their sacred tentacles," Florbish exclaimed, his voice translator struggling to keep up with the sudden influx of hyper-caffeinated thoughts that were bouncing around his cranium like excited particles in a very small, very energetic accelerator. This is absolutely, completely, magnificently impossible. This substance is simultaneously killing me and making me more alive than I've ever been. Destiny beamed with the kind of pride typically reserved for parents watching their children take first steps, or scientists discovering new forms of matter. Right? Coffee's amazing. You look like you could use another shot of espresso in there. Really get that energy flowing. Another shot? Another shot? Floorbish's newly enhanced cognitive abilities immediately calculated the potential consequences of additional caffeine intake with the kind of mathematical precision he'd never possessed before in his entire existence. The results were either catastrophically dangerous, the most exciting thing that had ever happened to him, or quite possibly both simultaneously in ways that defied conventional logic. "Yes!" he declared, his vocal translator now struggling with what appeared to be pure enthusiasm mixed with impending doom and a suddenly acquired expertise in beverage science. "More poison, all the poison. I must understand how you've achieved this impossible biological adaptation." Back on the research vessel, Professor Quilnox watched the biometric readings from Floorbish's suit with the kind of horror typically reserved for watching supernovas happen in one's immediate vicinity. The readings showed impossible spikes in neural activity, cardiovascular function, and something their instruments couldn't identify but were fairly certain shouldn't exist according to any known laws of physics, biology, or common sense. "Sir!" Blitherick shrieked, his tentacles flailing with panic levels that registered somewhere between mild catastrophe and universe-ending disaster. "He's consumed the caffeine. His biosigns are completely off any known charts. His brain activity levels are approaching what our computers are classifying as theoretically impossible. Should we extract him? Should we quarantine the planet? Should we call for backup? Should we update our wills?" "No!" Quilnox shouted, though whether from scientific curiosity, morbid fascination, or complete paralysis in the face of unprecedented impossibility, even he wasn't entirely sure. "This is unprecedented. This is historically significant. We're witnessing the first recorded case of interspecies caffeine consumption. We need to document everything. This could revolutionize our understanding of xenobiology, evolutionary adaptation, and the fundamental nature of what constitutes poisonous versus beneficial." On Earth, Floorbish was having what could generously be described as an experience, and more accurately characterized as a complete paradigm shift regarding the nature of reality, consciousness, and the possibility that everything he'd ever learned about toxicology was hilariously wrong. The second espresso shot had pushed his Andromedan physiology into completely uncharted territory that his species' medical science had no framework for understanding. He could suddenly see mathematical equations floating in the air like beautiful, caffeinated hallucinations. He understood the complex social dynamics of every human in the coffee shop with crystal clarity. He had developed strong opinions about optimal milk steaming temperatures, the philosophical implications of different roasting techniques, and the socio-cultural significance of foam art patterns. "The humans," he reported back through his communicator, speaking so rapidly that his words were practically tripping over each other in their caffeine-fueled haste to escape his mouth. "They're not consuming poison. They're not even accidentally tolerating poison. They're consuming liquid enlightenment. This coffee substance doesn't harm them. It transforms them. They've discovered a way to chemically optimize their cognitive function while simultaneously engaging in complex social bonding. Rituals centered around shared neurotoxin consumption that somehow functions as community building, economic activity, and what appears to be a form of voluntary pharmaceutical enhancement." Professor Quilnox felt his carefully constructed understanding of xenobiology, evolutionary development, and basic common sense crumbling like a sandcastle being attacked by particularly vengeful ocean waves. That's completely impossible. No species would willingly develop dependency on neurotoxins for cognitive enhancement. It's evolutionary suicide. It violates every principle of natural selection. It's like deciding that the best way to improve your vision is to poke yourself in the eyes with sticks. But sir, Florbish's voice crackled with caffeinated excitement that was probably visible from space. What if it's not evolutionary suicide? What if it's evolutionary genius? What if humans have somehow managed to develop a symbiotic relationship with caffeine that allows them to transcend normal biological limitations? What if they're not poisoning themselves? They're upgrading themselves. They've turned a deadly neurotoxin into a cognitive enhancement tool. The implications were absolutely staggering and challenged everything they thought they understood about biological development, chemical tolerance, and what constituted reasonable life choices. If humans had somehow managed to turn a deadly neurotoxin into a beneficial cognitive enhancement substance, it suggested levels of adaptive capability that made every other known evolutionary development look like minor adjustments in comparison. It was like discovering that someone had figured out how to breathe fire without burning their lungs, how to fly by insulting gravity until it gave up and went home, or how to achieve immortality by convincing death that it had better things to do. Florbish spent the next several hours in what could only be described as a caffeine-fueled anthropological research frenzy that probably violated several academic ethical guidelines and definitely exceeded his original mission parameters. He observed humans in their natural coffee shop habitat with the dedication of someone who had just discovered that everything they thought they knew about the universe was adorably, hilariously incorrect, documenting their rituals with scientific precision, enhanced by supernatural levels of caffeinated focus. He watched office workers queue for their morning fix with devotion that rivaled religious pilgrimages. He observed students consuming multiple cups while engaged in activities their databases labeled as cramming, which appeared to be some form of intellectual masochism involving the rapid absorption of vast quantities of information under impossible time constraints while running on pure liquid motivation. He witnessed complex social bonding occurring over shared caffeine consumption, intricate mating rituals disguised as coffee dates, business negotiations conducted with energy levels that suggested everyone involved was powered by controlled explosions, and artistic endeavors that seemed to be directly correlated with caffeine intake levels. They've created an entire civilization around poison consumption, Florbish reported, his words tumbling over each other like caffeinated acrobats performing increasingly complex routines. There are specialists called baristas who have elevated neurotoxin preparation to an art form that combines chemistry, performance art, and what appears to be magical thinking. They have hierarchies of poison strength: light roast, medium roast, dark roast, espresso, cold brew, each with its own devoted following, complex preparation rituals, and philosophical implications. Some humans consume multiple variants throughout the day, creating sophisticated layered neurotoxin, experiences that suggest they've developed personal poison consumption strategies optimized for different activities, moods, and social situations. The most disturbing discovery came when Florbish attempted to map the global distribution and cultural significance of coffee consumption. The results showed that the most caffeine-dependent humans weren't the weakest, most vulnerable members of their species. They were the strongest, most successful, most cognitively capable specimens humanity had to offer. Politicians running entire governments on coffee-fueled decision-making, scientists making groundbreaking discoveries while powered by espresso, artists creating masterpieces with energy derived from controlled neurotoxin consumption. Business leaders conducting complex negotiations while operating on what should have been lethal doses of alkaloid compounds. "Sir," Blitherick whispered, studying the incoming data with the kind of awe typically reserved for witnessing the birth of stars, the formation of galaxies, or really impressive fireworks displays. "What if we've been approaching this completely wrong? What if caffeine isn't poison to humans? What if it's fuel? What if they've somehow evolved beyond the normal limitations of toxicity and developed the ability to metabolize harmful substances for beneficial effects?" Back in the laboratory, the research team was experiencing what could best be described as a collective existential crisis, combined with scientific enlightenment and possibly some form of species-wide imposter syndrome. Everything they thought they understood about toxicology, evolutionary biology, basic survival instincts, and what constituted rational behavior had been thrown out the nearest airlock and replaced with the unsettling realization that humans had somehow managed to turn their morning beverage routine into a performance-enhancing drug distribution system that actually worked better than most pharmaceutical interventions. "We need more data," Professor Quilnox declared, though his voice carried the tremor of someone who suspected that acquiring more data might only make the situation exponentially more confusing and possibly challenge additional fundamental assumptions about reality. "Deploy additional surveillance probes. We need to understand the full scope of this coffee phenomenon and its implications for everything we thought we knew about biological adaptation." The additional probes revealed that coffee was merely the beginning of humanity's apparently systematic approach to beneficial toxin consumption. Humans had developed an entire category of beverages containing caffeine, tea, energy drinks, sodas, and something called pre-workout supplements that appeared to be liquid insanity packaged in convenient single-serving containers with warning labels that most species would interpret as "do not consume under any circumstances." The deal: they consumed caffeine in the morning to initiate consciousness, in the afternoon to prevent cognitive collapse, during late-night work sessions because sleep was apparently considered optional, and sometimes recreationally because they had decided that baseline human cognitive function was insufficiently interesting. Most disturbing of all, they had created decaffeinated coffee, which suggested that some humans enjoyed the ritual, taste, and social aspects of coffee consumption, but wanted to avoid the cognitive enhancement effects. This was like voluntarily choosing to wear blindfolds because enhanced vision was somehow inconvenient, or deciding that thinking more clearly was an undesirable side effect of their beverage choices. "The psychological and sociological implications are staggering," reported Dr. Vex 7, the expedition's chief xenopsychologist, whose normally calm professional demeanor had been replaced by the wild-eyed expression of someone who had stared too long into the abyss of human behavioral patterns and discovered that the abyss was not only staring back, but was also probably caffeinated. "They've developed complex dependency relationships with a substance that by any reasonable definition qualifies as a psychoactive drug. But instead of treating this as substance abuse requiring intervention, they've normalized it to the point where not consuming caffeine is considered abnormal, antisocial, and possibly a sign of poor life choices." The research team was forced to confront the increasingly unavoidable possibility that humans weren't just accidentally consuming poison and somehow surviving. They were deliberately optimizing their neurochemistry through carefully controlled toxin intake with a sophistication that suggested they understood principles of biochemistry that most galactic civilizations hadn't even discovered yet. It was like finding out that someone had figured out how to improve their cardiovascular health by repeatedly hitting themselves in the chest with hammers, or enhance their cognitive abilities by deliberately inducing controlled seizures while solving mathematical equations. Florbish, meanwhile, had become something of a legend at Joe's Coffee Corner, though probably not for reasons that would make his supervisors proud. His enthusiasm for coffee was matched only by his complete inability to consume it like a normal human being, and his tendency to provide detailed scientific commentary on every aspect of the coffee preparation and consumption process. He approached each cup like a xenobiologist studying a fascinating new life form, which, from his perspective, was essentially accurate. "You're really into coffee, aren't you?" Destiny observed, watching Florbish examine his 7th espresso of the morning with the intensity typically reserved for defusing nuclear weapons, performing brain surgery, or attempting to understand the instructions for assembling furniture from a certain Swedish retailer. "Like more than most people. Are you writing a book or something? I am conducting scientific research of unprecedented importance," Florbish explained, his caffeine-enhanced brain now operating at levels that made his species' greatest philosophers look like they were thinking through several feet of thick molasses while wearing mittens. "Your people have achieved something extraordinary that challenges every known principle of xenobiology. You've transformed a neurotoxin into a cognitive enhancement tool while simultaneously creating complex social, economic, and cultural structures around its consumption. This represents a level of biological and cultural adaptation that may be unique in the known galaxy." Destiny blinked slowly, processing this information with the kind of careful consideration typically reserved for complex philosophical problems or really difficult crossword puzzle clues. Yeah, coffee's pretty great. You want to try our new seasonal blend? It's got hints of chocolate and caramel, and we're doing this new thing with oat milk that's supposed to be really smooth." The breathtaking simplicity of the human response was perhaps the most profound discovery of all. To humans, coffee wasn't a miraculous achievement in biochemical adaptation that violated fundamental principles of toxicology. It was just coffee. They didn't see themselves as performing daily feats of toxicological mastery that should have been impossible. They were just trying to achieve sufficient consciousness to face another day of existence, pay their bills, interact with other humans without homicidal impulses, and maybe accomplish something useful before bedtime. This casual attitude toward what should have been completely impossible was perhaps the most perfectly human characteristic imaginable. They had achieved something that violated every known principle of biology, pharmacology, evolutionary development, and common sense, and their collective response was essentially, "Yeah, it's pretty good. Helps me get through Monday mornings and Tuesday afternoons, and pretty much every other time I need to be awake and functional." The revelation hit Professor Quillnox like a collapsing neutron star. Humans weren't surviving despite consuming caffeine. They had evolved to consume caffeine. Somewhere in their species' development, probably during a period their historians referred to as really difficult times, they had formed a symbiotic relationship with this particular alkaloid compound that allowed them to function at enhanced cognitive levels while maintaining the casual demeanor of a species that considered this perfectly normal and definitely not worth making a big deal about. "By the eternal void and all its caffeinated mysteries," Professor Quillnox whispered, staring at data streams that showed human civilization had essentially constructed itself around systematic caffeine consumption. "They're not poisoning themselves. They're fueling themselves. Coffee isn't their weakness, it's their secret weapon. They've weaponized their morning beverage." The implications for galactic civilization were enormous and probably violated several interstellar treaties regarding biological weapons development. If humans could successfully integrate neurotoxins into their daily routine for cognitive enhancement, what other impossible adaptations had they achieved? Were there other substances they consumed that should have killed them but somehow made them stronger? Were they systematically turning other forms of poison into performance enhancers while maintaining that this was just normal Tuesday behavior? Further investigation revealed a horrifying pattern. Humans also consumed something called alcohol, a literal cellular toxin that they used for relaxation and social bonding. They regularly ingested capsaicin, which triggered pain receptors throughout their digestive systems and somehow made them happy. They deliberately exposed themselves to electromagnetic radiation they called sunlight and considered it essential for health. They consumed processed sugars in quantities that should have induced immediate comas. They ate foods so spicy that other species used them as weapons, and they called this cuisine. They engaged in activities they labeled exercise that appeared to involve systematically damaging their muscle tissue for the purpose of making it stronger. They're not just adapted to survive, Blitherick realized, his voice filled with the kind of awe typically reserved for witnessing the birth of universes, the discovery of new dimensions, or really spectacular magic tricks. They're adapted to thrive on things that should kill them. They've turned toxin consumption into an art form, recreational activity, social bonding experience, and performance enhancement strategy. The research team was forced to completely revise their understanding of human biology, psychology, and what constituted reasonable life choices. These weren't creatures who had accidentally stumbled into poison consumption. They were biological alchemists, transforming harmful substances into beneficial effects through sheer evolutionary audacity, combined with what appeared to be a species-wide commitment to the philosophy that if something didn't kill you immediately, it was probably worth trying to turn it into a recreational activity. The most shocking discovery came when they intercepted communications about something humans called energy drinks, beverages that contained caffeine levels so extreme that they came with warning labels in multiple languages. Humans consumed these, not just willingly, but enthusiastically, often in combination with physical exercise that would have challenged the endurance of most galactic species even without chemical enhancement. They're combining neurotoxins with physical stress, Dr. Vex7 reported, his voice reaching frequencies that made nearby equipment vibrate sympathetically. They consume concentrated caffeine solutions and then deliberately subject themselves to cardiovascular strain. By all known principles of biology, this should result in immediate cardiac failure. Instead, they call it working out and consider it a healthy lifestyle choice. Florbish, by now permanently stationed at Joe's Coffee Corner as the galaxy's first official alien coffee research liaison, had begun what he enthusiastically called advanced coffee research and cultural immersion studies. This involved systematically trying every possible combination of coffee drinks available while providing detailed scientific commentary on the psychological, physiological, sociological and philosophical implications of each beverage choice, preparation method, and consumption ritual. The macchiato, he reported to his increasingly bewildered research team through his quantum communicator, represents the human desire to modify their toxin intake with surgical precision. They don't just consume caffeine, they customize their caffeine experience based on time of day, personal preferences, social situations, and what appears to be complex individual optimization strategies. This suggests not just biological adaptation, but active engineering of their neurotoxin consumption. Buttons! His research notes had become increasingly difficult to pass, partly because caffeine appeared to enhance Andromedan cognitive function in ways that made normal communication nearly impossible, and partly because he was now thinking and writing faster than his translation software could process, creating a backlog of caffeinated observations that threatened to overwhelm the ship's data storage systems. Subject has discovered cold brew, he transmitted, with the excitement of someone who had just unlocked the secrets of the universe, which appears to be concentrated caffeine extracted through time-intensive processes that increase potency while reducing acidity. Humans have developed industrial methods for optimizing their poison intake. They have machinery, standardized procedures, quality control measures, and what appears to be an entire scientific discipline devoted to maximizing the Beneficial effects of neurotoxin consumption while minimizing side effects. This is beyond biological adaptation. This is technological enhancement of toxin processing. The most mind-bending discovery came when Florbish witnessed something that fundamentally changed his understanding of human caffeine relationships. A human consuming coffee while visibly ill. According to every principle of toxicology, pharmacology, and basic common sense, consuming neurotoxins while fighting illness should have been catastrophically dangerous, possibly fatal, and definitely stupid. Instead, the human reported feeling much better after finishing her latte and resumed normal activities with what appeared to be enhanced immune function and restored energy levels. "They're using caffeine as medicine," Florbish reported, his voice reaching frequencies that were probably illegal in several galactic sectors and definitely causing minor seismic disturbances in the local area. Not only have they adapted to survive neurotoxin consumption, they've weaponized it against illness. Their morning poison doubles as therapeutic treatment. They're practicing a form of biochemical warfare against their own biological limitations. The research team made another disturbing discovery while analyzing human coffee culture. They had developed elaborate social rituals around the sharing of their neurotoxin consumption. Something called coffee breaks, where humans gathered in groups to consume poison while engaging in social bonding. Coffee dates, where humans used shared toxin consumption as a foundation for romantic relationships. Business meetings, where important decisions were made while everyone involved was under the influence of cognitive enhancement drugs. They've integrated neurotoxin consumption into every aspect of their society, Blitherick observed, his tentacles writhing with something between fascination and horror. Politics, romance, business, art, science, everything happens while they're chemically enhanced. They've created a civilization that literally runs on controlled poisoning. Professor Quilnox realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. A species that had not only adapted to consume toxic substances, but had made toxin consumption the foundation of their entire social, economic, and cultural structure. Every major human achievement had occurred while the participants were under the influence of caffeine. Their greatest scientific discoveries, their most beautiful art, their most important political decisions, all accomplished while running on what should have been lethal doses of neurotoxins. The final piece of the puzzle came when they discovered human children. Young humans who had not yet developed caffeine tolerance were carefully protected from coffee consumption until they reached what humans called college age, at which point they were systematically introduced to caffeine through elaborate initiation rituals involving something called all-nighters and finals week. They have a coming-of-age ceremony centered around neurotoxin consumption, Dr. Vex7 shrieked, his normally professional composure completely abandoned. They protect their young from caffeine until their brains are fully developed, then deliberately introduce them to systematic poisoning as a rite of passage into adulthood. It's like a species-wide initiation into a chemical enhancement cult. Back on the research vessel, the team had moved beyond scientific curiosity into something approaching religious revelation mixed with existential terror. They were witnessing a species that had achieved something that violated every known law of biology, the successful integration of toxic compounds into daily life for net positive effect across multiple domains of existence, from individual cognitive enhancement to species-wide cultural development. This changes everything we thought we knew about evolution, adaptation, and what constitutes intelligent life, Professor Quilnox declared, staring at readouts that showed human civilization essentially operating as a caffeine-powered machine of impossible complexity. We're not looking at a species that accidentally consumes poison. We're looking at a species that has mastered poison consumption and turned it into the foundation of their entire technological and cultural development. The galactic implications were staggering and probably required immediate consultation with philosophers, ethicists, and possibly therapists specializing in species-wide identity crises. If humans could turn neurotoxins into cognitive enhancers, stimulants into social bonding tools, and poison into productivity boosters, what other impossible adaptations had they achieved? Their ability to consume coffee suggested levels of biological flexibility that challenged every assumption about evolutionary development and what constituted the limits of adaptation. The decision to make formal contact was both inevitable and terrifying. Professor Quilnox, speaking for the Galactic Health Monitoring Division and trying to sound professional while dealing with information that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality, carefully explained their initial concern about human caffeine consumption and their growing amazement at humanity's apparent immunity to what should have been lethal neurotoxin exposure. The human response came from someone identified as Dr. Elena Rodriguez-Patterson, director of the International Coffee Research Institute, whose title alone suggested that humans had not only institutionalized their poison consumption studies, but had created entire academic disciplines devoted to optimizing their neurotoxin intake strategies. Greetings from Earth, Doctor. Rodriguez-Patterson's transmission began with the kind of casual cheerfulness that apparently characterized all human communication about their toxic beverage habits, as if discussing systematic species-wide poison consumption was equivalent to chatting about the weather. We're absolutely delighted to hear from you. Yes, we're completely aware that caffeine is technically a neurotoxin. That's actually why it works so well for us. The toxicity is precisely what provides the cognitive enhancement effects we've learned to harness. Professor Quilnox felt his carefully constructed worldview completing its final transformation into confused rubble. The humans weren't just aware that coffee was poison. They appreciated it because it was poison. They had somehow developed not just physical tolerance, but psychological appreciation for the toxic properties that made other species avoid caffeine entirely. We've been drinking coffee for several centuries now, Doctor. Rodriguez-Patterson continued with the tone of someone discussing a perfectly reasonable hobby, rather than systematic species-wide toxin consumption that should have resulted in extinction. And some of our greatest scientific breakthroughs, artistic achievements, and technological innovations were directly fueled by caffeine. Newton developed calculus during a particularly productive coffee-fueled period. Mozart composed some of his finest symphonies while running on espresso. The entire Industrial Revolution was basically powered by increasingly sophisticated coffee preparation methods and widespread caffeine adoption. This was perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all. Human civilization hadn't developed despite their coffee consumption. It had developed because of it. Their greatest achievements in science, art, technology, and culture were directly linked to their daily toxin intake. They had built their entire civilizational advancement on a foundation of controlled, systematic, optimized poisoning. We're actually quite curious about your species' relationship with psychoactive compounds, Dr. Rodriguez-Patterson added with the casual scientific interest of someone proposing a perfectly normal research collaboration. Do you have any stimulants or cognitive enhancers that work for your physiology? We're always interested in comparative pharmacology studies and cross-species biochemical research. The breathtaking casualness with which she suggested that aliens might want to study human poison consumption methods and potentially adopt similar strategies was perhaps the most perfectly human response imaginable. Faced with beings from another galaxy expressing concern about their toxic beverage habits, they immediately offered to share their knowledge of neurotoxin optimization and possibly help other species develop their own versions of impossible biological adaptations. Professor Quilnox realized they were dealing with a species that had not only mastered impossible biological adaptations, but had done so with such casual competence that they considered their achievements normal enough to offer educational services to other civilizations who might want to learn the fine art of beneficial poison consumption. Perhaps, he transmitted back, with the careful tone of someone navigating uncharted diplomatic waters while questioning the fundamental nature of reality, we could arrange some form of cultural and scientific exchange program. We're very interested in understanding your optimization techniques and adaptive strategies. Dr. Rodriguez-Patterson's response was immediate, enthusiastic, and slightly terrifying. Absolutely. We'd love to introduce you to our coffee culture. Fair warning, though, most alien visitors we've encountered find our caffeine tolerance levels somewhat overwhelming at first. We strongly recommend starting with decaffeinated varieties and working your way up very, very slowly. Oh, and definitely avoid anything stronger than a mild latte until you've built up some tolerance. We learned that lesson the hard way with the Centaurian trade delegation last year. 3 of them ended up vibrating at frequencies that shattered several windows. The casual revelation that humans had previous experience with alien visitors having adverse reactions to coffee consumption, and that they had developed standardized safety protocols for introducing extraterrestrial species to caffeine, was simultaneously reassuring and absolutely terrifying. It suggested they were fully aware of the extreme nature of their beverage choices, but had chosen to continue anyway, complete with appropriate safety warnings and emergency procedures for visiting extraterrestrials who might accidentally consume human-strength coffee. The cultural exchange program that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history and probably violated several interstellar treaties regarding the introduction of psychoactive substances to alien species. Human coffee experts, treating alien visitors like adventurous tourists trying exotic local cuisine, carefully guided various galactic species through graduated caffeine exposure programs with the kind of systematic approach typically reserved for pharmaceutical trials or controlled scientific experiments. They had developed detailed protocols for introducing aliens to coffee, complete with safety measures, biological monitoring procedures, emergency response plans, and what they cheerfully called caffeine poisoning prevention techniques, a phrase that managed to be both reassuring and deeply disturbing simultaneously. The fact that humans had developed specialized expertise in preventing caffeine poisoning while continuing to consume caffeine themselves in quantities that would probably qualify as poisoning for most other species was perhaps the most perfectly paradoxical achievement in the known universe. Florbish had become something of a local celebrity and informal scientific ambassador. His caffeine-enhanced cognitive abilities had made him incredibly useful for solving complex mathematical problems that stumped human computers, providing relationship advice with supernatural insight, offering surprisingly profound commentary on human behavioral patterns, and serving as a living example that aliens could successfully adapt to human coffee culture without immediately dying. The true beauty of coffee, he explained to a new group of visiting xenobiologists who had arrived to study the impossible phenomenon of human caffeine consumption, isn't just that humans have adapted to consume it without dying. It's that they've created an entire civilization around the controlled consumption of neurotoxins. Every coffee shop is a monument to humanity's ability to turn poison into productivity, social bonding, economic activity, and cultural expression. His enthusiasm was infectious, though the visiting scientists were extremely careful to limit their own caffeine exposure after watching Florbish vibrate through several different dimensional frequencies, following his morning routine of what he now called optimal cognitive enhancement dosing, which involved consuming enough espresso to power a small spacecraft while maintaining the casual demeanor of someone who considered this perfectly normal Tuesday behavior. The final breakthrough came when Dr. Rodriguez-Patterson shared the most stunning revelation of all. Humans were developing new forms of caffeine consumption. Cold brew concentrate that could be diluted to various strength levels. Caffeine pills for precise dosing. Something called bulletproof coffee that combined caffeine with fats for sustained energy release. They were actively evolving their poison consumption techniques, constantly improving and optimizing their neurotoxin intake strategies. "We're always working on better ways to deliver caffeine," she explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing agricultural improvements rather than the advancement of systematic species-wide chemical enhancement. "Recently, we've been experimenting with time-release formulations, combination therapies with other natural compounds, and personalized dosing based on individual metabolism. The future of coffee is really exciting." The research team realized they weren't just observing a species that had adapted to consume poison. They were witnessing a civilization that was actively perfecting the art of beneficial toxin consumption, treating it as an ongoing scientific endeavor worthy of continuous research and development. The final report submitted to the Galactic Health Monitoring Division was unlike any document in their extensive archives and probably required the creation of entirely new filing categories. Instead of a standard toxicology warning or species classification report, it read more like an anthropological study of impossible evolutionary achievement combined with a philosophical meditation on the nature of adaptation and the limits of biological possibility. Humans have successfully integrated neurotoxin consumption into their daily routine, not through accident, ignorance, or evolutionary mishap, but through sophisticated biological and cultural adaptation that represents a fundamental breakthrough in the relationship between organisms and toxic substances. Coffee consumption represents not a health risk requiring intervention, but a cognitive enhancement strategy so successful that it has become fundamental to human civilization, technological development, cultural expression, and social organization. Furthermore, humans continue to advance their caffeine consumption techniques through active research and development, treating neurotoxin optimization as an ongoing scientific discipline. They have transformed what should be a biological limitation into a competitive advantage and continue to improve upon their achievements. Recommendation: coffee should be reclassified not as poison, but as humanity's first successful venture into deliberate biochemical optimization. Their achievement suggests that the traditional categories of toxic and beneficial may be inadequate for understanding advanced biological adaptation. Immediate establishment of formal diplomatic and scientific exchange programs recommended to learn from human expertise in impossible biological engineering. The report's conclusion was even more remarkable. Humans don't drink coffee despite it being poison. They drink coffee because it's poison, and they've figured out how to make poison work for them instead of against them through a combination of biological adaptation, cultural optimization, and ongoing technological innovation. This represents a level of biological and cultural sophistication that appears to be unique in the known galaxy, and fundamentally challenges our understanding of what constitutes intelligent adaptation to environmental challenges. Professor Quilnox, reviewing the final data compilation one last time, could only shake his head in amazement and profound respect. They had set out to investigate what appeared to be a simple case of species-wide accidental poisoning, and had instead discovered a civilization that had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history: the successful weaponization of their morning beverage routine for cognitive enhancement, social cohesion, economic development, and cultural expression. And they had accomplished this impossible feat so casually, so completely, and with such remarkable competence that they considered it normal enough to offer educational workshops to visiting aliens while simultaneously working to improve their techniques through ongoing scientific research. As the research vessel prepared to return to Andromeda with data that would revolutionize galactic understanding of evolutionary biology, Professor Quilnox received one final transmission from Dr. Rodriguez-Patterson. Thanks for the absolutely fascinating research collaboration. We've learned so much from studying how caffeine affects different physiologies. Based on our findings, we're developing a new line of specialty blends designed specifically for various alien species. If you're ever back in this part of the galaxy, we'd love to have you try our new Andromedan blend. We think you'll find it provides excellent cognitive enhancement without the dimensional frequency issues you experienced with our standard espresso. The casual mention that humans had used their research collaboration to develop alien-specific coffee blends, complete with species-appropriate modifications for optimal cognitive enhancement, was perhaps the perfect ending to the most bewildering, enlightening, and paradigm-shifting scientific expedition in recorded galactic history. Professor Quilnox closed the research files and settled back into his command chair, contemplating a universe that had revealed itself to be far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had ever imagined. Somewhere in the Milky Way galaxy, an entire species had turned the simple act of drinking poison into the foundation of an advanced civilization, and they'd done it so well that they were now teaching other species how to do it too. Coffee, it turned out, wasn't humanity's strangest habit, it was their greatest achievement.